The world watched with bated breath, thinking this would be the end. Fleets surrounded her waters. Sanctions tightened like a noose around her throat. The most powerful nations lined up like executioners, convinced that one final push would bring her to her knees. But instead of breaking, Iran stood up, not just with defiance, with a resolve that sent shockwaves from Washington to Tel Aviv, from London to Rio. They came to break Iran, but its courage shook the entire world. The plan was methodical, decades in the making. They had studied Iran's every fault line, political, economic, social. They thought they knew her weaknesses better than she did, but they misunderstood one thing: Iran's strength wasn't just in its missiles or oil reserves. It was in its people, the pro-Palestinian, in the mothers who buried their sons without surrender, in the fathers who rebuilt homes after bombings, in the students who turned underground bunkers into laboratories of resistance. It began with whispers, leaks from intelligence agencies, reports in international newspapers. Planned to destabilize Iran from within, stir the protests, spark economic despair, fund dissidents, divide the clergy from the state, turn the people against their own sovereignty. They called it controlled chaos. Chaos doesn't follow orders. Tehran knew. Long before the world caught on, the Iranian leadership had been watching. Listening, preparing, every ambassador expelled, every diplomat's smile scrutinized, every contract offered by foreign companies examined like a trap. They weren't paranoid. They were precise, because in the corridors of power, they had learned that those who smile at you in daylight often come to bury you by nightfall. First wave wasn't military. It was financial. Banks were cut off. Deals were shredded, currency crashed, imports stopped, and yet Iran didn't fall. It adapted, purged secret routes, revived barter systems, turned to neighbors and old allies, and when even those were shut, it turned inward, producing its own medicine, building its own tech, and training its scientists. Pain became a university. Pressure became fuel. Then came the cyber strikes. As deadly as any bomb infiltrated power grids, silenced centrifuges, blacked out cities. But for every virus uploaded, Iran wrote an antidote. It learned. It retaliated. It built walls not just of concrete but of code. Every attack turned into a lesson. Every hack became a test, and Iran passed them all. And then came the airstrike. Missiles in the night. Explosions that tried to erase not just military targets but symbols of pride. Research facilities, cultural landmarks, even civilian airports. The world media showed flames and rubble. What it didn't show was the aftermath, how people returned in the morning, sweeping streets, raising flags, handing water to rescue teams. There was no panic, only purpose. It was when the world expected surrender, when the global powers had tightened every screw, that Iran made its boldest move. It did not just defend. It spoke in the UN press conferences, in grainy videos sent from underground bunkers. Iranian voices rang with clarity, not threats, not hatred, but history, sovereignty, the right to exist without bending to empires, the right to say no. And that no echoed far beyond the Middle East. The youth, born under sanctions, raised in scarcity, became Iran's frontline, not with weapons, but with wit. They flooded social media with truth, those double standards. They challenged journalists. Palestine movement. They embarrassed diplomats. And when foreign influencers came to sell fake narratives, they responded not with violence, with stories of survival, of rebuilding schools after bombings, of celebrating weddings under sirens. By now, a movement. Even those within the enemy's walls began to whisper, maybe they were wrong. Maybe this wasn't a regime versus a people. Maybe this was a nation refusing to be colonized again. Maybe this was a country that remembered Mossadegh, that hadn't forgotten the coup, that still carried the scars of chemical weapons supplied by Western hands during the Iran-Iraq war. And maybe, just maybe, this courage wasn't fanaticism. It was faith. Faith in identity. Faith in resistance. Faith that the soil their martyrs bled on was sacred enough to defend. Not for politics, but for dignity. So they sent assassins, stage teams. The CIA, MI6. Names that echoed through Tehran like ghosts. Scientists were killed. Generals were targeted. But for every fallen name, 10 more rose. And none retreated. They wore death like armor and walked toward destiny unflinching. They built where destruction fell. They prayed where blood was spilled. They endured where others would have collapsed. And still, the world called it madness, dictatorship, oppression. Deep down, behind closed doors, even the most cynical Western analysts began to admitting Iran was not just surviving, it was outmaneuvering, outlasting, outthinking. This wasn't the narrative they expected. They wanted riots. They got resilience, They wanted division. They got unity. They expected surrender. They got strategy, movement. What frightened the world most wasn't Iran's missiles. It was its memory, its history, its refusal to forget what empire had done, to forget how the world stayed silent as Iraqi gas choked Iranian lungs, how civilian aircraft were shot down and called mistakes, how cultural dignity was mocked in foreign media while blood was spilled in its streets. So when the final phase of the campaign launched, with everything from economic siege to military provocation, Iran did not answer with rage. It answered with resolve. Israeli jets violated the skies. Iranian drones filmed them calmly, silently, tracking, warning, choosing not to fire. Not yet. When provocations came from the Gulf, Iran didn't fall for the bait. It protected its waters with precision, not panic. Its silence was strategic. Its calm, terrifying, because Iran knew. The world wasn't watching with clean hands. It was watching with guilt. And that guilt was growing heavier. The more the West pushed, the more people began asking, why is this nation being cornered? Why are its children growing up under sanctions while war profiteers grow richer? Why are its scientists hunted while others win Nobel Prizes for lesser feats? Why is resistance called terror when submission is called peace? These questions didn't stay in Iran. They spread to Lebanon, to Syria, to Iraq, to Latin America, to Africa. Nations with similar scars, they saw Iran not as a threat, as a movement. And the more they watched, the more they believed that dignity, once awakened, is more powerful than any drone, any dollar, any doctrine. Iran became the symbol of a nation that wouldn't kneel, a nation that could be starved, bombed, isolated, but never broken. And that terrified those who had grown used to watching nations fall like dominoes. They came to break Iran. But Iran wasn't a machine to be broken. It was a soul that refused to be sold. The silence of Iran was never emptiness. It was strategy. In a world screaming with propaganda, Iran whispered with patience. While enemy satellites hovered overhead and foreign, analysts predicted collapse. Something else was unfolding beneath the surface. Iran was not just resisting. It was recalibrating. Inside the labs of Isfahan and the underground tunnels of Natanz, scientists worked without sleep, not out of fear, but out of purpose. For every piece of technology denied by sanctions, they reverse engineered another. What they lacked in access, they compensated for with innovation. They developed medicines banned by embargoes, created drones without Western components, advanced nuclear enrichment using homegrown brilliance. The embargo had not halted progress. It had triggered a renaissance. The West saw this and panicked. What kind of people build rockets with scrap? What kind of students construct satellites with second-hand materials? What kind of engineers break through cyber firewalls using self-written code? Iran wasn't isolated. It was evolving. At the same time, battlefield extended far beyond the borders of its soil. In Syria, Hezbollah fighters trained under Iranian advisors, strategic, precise, and prepared. In Iraq, militias inspired by Iran's doctrine pushed back foreign influence. In Yemen, Houthis, driven by the spirit of resistance, challenged kingdoms thought untouchable. And in Gaza, Palestinian youth, once stone throwers, now launched drones empowered not just by tools, but by ideology. This wasn't just a fight for Iran. It was a philosophy, one that whispered in the ears of the oppressing, they may have power, but you have purpose. The more Iran stood tall, the more others began to straighten their backs. In Latin America, leaders once fearful of US intervention began revisiting Tehran. In Africa, nations crippled by colonial chains saw Iran not as a rogue state, a rebel heart. In Asia, powers once distant grew curious and closer. The world map was shifting, and Iran was drawing the new lines. Inside the country, every funeral turned into a rally. Every martyr became a symbol, not of loss, but of legacy. Their faces adorned walls, their stories taught in schools. Children grew up not with cartoons of superheroes, but with real stories of sacrifice. Stories of Qasem Soleimani, who became a legend beyond his death. Stories of scientists like Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, who built knowledge under threat of assassinations. These weren't just names. They were seeds planted deep into the Iranian soul. And the soil was fertile. Even under brutal sanctions, literacy soared, universities expanded. Women became scientists, pilots, coders. While the West expected regression, Iran leaped forward, quietly, steadily. Its weapons advanced, but so did its will. It didn't just build bombs, it built belief. So the attacks became more desperate. They tried funding opposition media, creating narratives of division, pitting ethnic groups against each other, funding separatist cells, promoting internal dissent. Here's what they didn't understand. Iranians could debate loudly, protest fiercely, disagree passionately. When foreign boots even whispered about crossing that border, they became one, united not under a regime, but under a flag soaked in memory. The West had failed to understand a simple truth, and that pain, when shared, becomes armor. They thought hunger would break them. It only sharpened their resolve. They thought isolation would weaken them. It only taught them to thrive alone. They thought assassinations would scare them. They only raised more hands, willing to die for something greater than life. By now, whispers of doubt had reached the heart of the enemy. In Tel Aviv, generals questioned their calculations. In Washington, think tanks rewrote their reports. In Brussels, diplomats began to say what they once feared, to thinking Iran was not falling. It was rising, and with it, something far more dangerous than missiles. An idea that nations could chart their own course without permission. Dignity was worth dying for, that sovereignty was sacred, that the age of colonial puppetry was over. Iran had not just survived, it had shattered an illusion. Only the West could define progress. That resistance was futile. That obedience brought peace. So what did they do? They doubled down. More sanctions, more cover-tops, more psychological warfare, more deals with traitors. But Iran had already adapted to the storm. It had built ships in shallow waters, launched satellites without external codes, created a web of allies from Caracas to Damascus. Its fighters were now diplomats. Its clerics were now technologists. Its poets were now cyber warriors. And its youth, its unstoppable youth, had tasted the beauty of self-reliance. While the world mocked them on social media, they responded with memes, satire, and fire. They hacked, decoded, exposed. They turned enemy propaganda into comedy. They didn't run from the digital war. They owned it. And when the world came knocking again, this time with the great of full-scale war, Iran didn't beg. It warned. Calmly, firmly, the precision of a surgeon and the confidence of a lion. The Strait of Hormuz stood as a gate Iran held the key to. And the message was simply, cross the red line and the world's economy burns. No panic, just clarity. And that clarity terrified oil markets generals and presidents. They came to break Iran. Iran had already broken the chains history once forced on it. It stood not because of power, but because of purpose. And now, that purpose was echoing through history again.